Hello lovely people, let's continue our McGrath swatching series. Last time I promised to you that I'm going to do the purples and possibly the pinks depending on how it goes, but I discovered as I was thinking about this, Mother has a lot of purples. Like, it's one of the most highly represented colors in her color stories, and I only realized that once I started thinking about which palettes I should pull out, and I realized that there are only a handful of palettes that don't feature a purple whatsoever. So without further ado, because this is going to take us a while, let's get started. I am going to start with the only purple that I own from her, which is in one of her singles. So this shade is not featured in any of her palettes, it is only available in her single Idol collection, and this is the shade Synthetica. And arguably, at least by my personal humble opinion, this is the most spectacular purple that McGrath has ever made. It's just, there is something beautiful about the texture, the shiftiness and the tone of this purple. It is just one of the most glorious purples that personally I have ever seen. So here you have Synthetica. It is such a beautiful shade. It has this sort of like smoky, very dark, taupey gray base with a ton of purple hue and a lot of sparkles to it, and it's just so incredibly beautiful. When you put it on the eye, it has this beautiful foiled effect. It works really well on its own. It also works really well when you layer it over top of other purples from McGrath. Overall, I think her best purple. Now, the only purple that I have seen which reminds me of Synthetica, and I don't think it's the same thing as Synthetica, but it is very similar to it, is in a palette that I don't actually own. If you guys remember, some years ago she released these palettes for Star Wars. I only have the red one, but the one with C-3PO contained a purple, which is now also featured in her big Celestial Divinity palette. So both of these, the 6-pan with the dark Galaxy, as well as the C-3PO palette, are now both featured in her big Celestial Divinity Mothership palette, or whatever it's called, the really huge one. And I'm pretty sure the purple that was featured in C-3PO is in there. And I think that purple is probably as close as you're going to get to Synthetica. Now, I've rambled about Synthetica long enough, so let's put her away and move on to the 6-pan eyeshadow palettes, where I'm going to start with the absolute epitome of a purple palette from McGrath, and that is the Lavender Rose Mini Mothership Subversive palette, which features not one, not two, not well, 3. Now, I am going to feature in this video what some might consider to be more mauve-leaning shades, because to me, like, mauves and like more like warm, very warm-toned, red-toned purples are still purples. So I'm going to feature all these 3 shades, whoops, excuse me, in this video. I'm just going to swatch all 3 of them first, and then we can quickly talk about them. This is the more metallic warm purple, and this is the true real purple. So here you have the 3 purple shades from the Lavender Rose. This shade is called Paranormal, this is the shade Euphoria, and this is the glorious Purple Rain. Now, Paranormal is not one of my favorite shades from palette, because at least the one that I have in this particular eyeshadow palette is quite dry, and it's not the type of dry. I've had like dry shadows from palette which are relatively easy to work with. I find this one a little bit difficult to work with. It's not one of my favorite shades. On the other hand, this one, the shade Euphoria, is absolutely beautiful. It's one of those like more satin leaning shades. It's not a punchy metallic, but it has this beautiful sheen to it, and it has such a beautiful complexity to it that it works really beautifully as a one and done shade. And speaking of glorious shades, Purple Rain is probably one of the most beautiful true purples that I have ever seen. It is once again in her more like satin formula, and it works beautifully as an eyeliner, as an all over the lid shade. If you want to intensify the outer corners, it's a very versatile shade because of the texture and the formula. Okay, this is from her Opulence 2018 collection. This is the Metamorphosis Palette, and the purple that I want to show you here is actually also featured in her C-3PO palette and thus in her Big Celestial Mega Mothership palette, and that is the shade, oh my goodness, I know the name of the shade, why am I blacking out? Smoked Amethyst. So this very, very smoky, deep black here with purple sparkle to it is the next purple I would like to swatch for you. You can absolutely see that this is so much deeper compared to everything else, even compared to Synthetica, which also has a very deep base. This is pretty much like a blackened purple, so it's a black base and it's packed with a purple sparkle to it. I personally really like to use this shade mostly as a shade to intensify the outer corners or as an eyeliner, but I don't like personally to use these kind of shades as an all over the lid shade because I just find it too smoky. Next up we have another one of the Opulence 2018 palettes. This is the Dark Star eyeshadow palette, where we have this very warm purple. That is the shade Deep Space. You can see the Deep Space has a very warm undertone to it, so it's more of that plum aubergine kind of purple. Again, it has this formula that is very similar to Purple Rain where it's not a metallic, but it's more like that very satin sheen that works really well to be blended out, so you don't have to rely on a matte if you want to intensify your outer corners or use this as an eyeliner. It works beautifully for that. Again, a shade I don't really use all over my lid. And last but not least, from the Sixpence, we have the Dark Star eyeshadow palette from the Star Wars collaboration. Again, this is featured in the Mega Mothership Celestial Divinity palette, where I would like to show you... Hey, Nicolacie! Poprawisz czuk, słońce? Okay guys, sorry, we had an unexpected interlude from Nicola, who decided to invite himself to this party, and he's absolutely not invited to a party where all of my Mothership palettes are laid out. Anyway, so the three purples I wanted to show you in here are again the shade Smoked Amethyst. I'm not going to swatch it again, it's just the blackened purple. And then we also have these two beautiful shades, the shade Venomous Void and the shade Odyssey. Now, Venomous Void is a very weird color to describe. To me, it's like a very mid-toned warm purple. You could argue that it's a different color. I don't know, we're going to swatch it anyway. And the shade Odyssey is again one of the absolutely most beautiful shades I have ever seen. It has this like smoky gray base again with a very interesting purple shift to it. And in the light that I'm looking at it right now, it doesn't even look purple, but I promise you it's a purple. So let's watch these two shades. So here you have the three purples from this palette: Smoked Amethyst, Venomous Void, and the shade Odyssey. They are so beautiful, especially the shade Odyssey is just such a complex, interesting shade with so many different shifts on it, and it definitely doesn't even look purple in a certain lighting. Like in the lighting that I'm looking at it from my angle right now, it almost looks like it's a golden with a bit of like a copper pink on it, but I can definitely tell you when I look at it straight into the mirror when I'm doing my makeup, it's like a smoked purple. It's such an interesting shade. Alright, now that we have swatched all the Sixpence, let's move into the Mothership. Mothership 2... Okay, Mothership 1 doesn't contain a purple. Mothership 2 contains a purple that is also featured in Divine Rose 1, so I'm going to show it to you there. So let's start with Mothership 3 Subversive, where I would classify Night Creature as a purple. It's like a magenta purple, I don't really know. Sometimes it's so hard to describe her shades because they're so incredibly complex. But to me, Night Creature is a gorgeous metallic mid-tone purple, which would actually work really well with the shade Venomous Void now that I'm looking at them next to each other. Next up, after Mothership 3 Subversive, we would technically have Decadence, but the purple in Decadence is also in the Interstellar Icon quad, so I'm going to show it to you when we reach the quads. So now we're moving straight into Mothership 5 Bronze Seduction, where we have this incredibly deep aubergine purple. I think it's also called something with aubergine. I think it's called Extreme Aubergine. It is a very deep shade. And I don't know whether you can tell from the pan of mine that I've used it very little, because when I go into this palette I tend to use much more the browns than I use this shade. You can also tell this shade has quite a dry texture. I'm gonna be honest with you, actually up till Mothership 5, some of the matte shades in the big Mothership palettes have quite a dry texture to them. So, for instance, the brown shades in here are to me drier than the mattes that come in Mothership 6 and the subsequent palettes. But especially this Extreme Aubergine shade is just super dry, and you can tell just from the swatch how incredibly difficult it is to work with. Well, I don't know, it's not difficult to work with, and I've used it very little to really have an opinion on it. I've used it a couple of times as an outer corner shade, and it has worked well for that, but I haven't used it enough to really have an opinion on it. But there you have it. It's like a very blackened plum aubergine purple. It's actually the exact color of what you would find on the outside of an aubergine. Okay, I'm starting to run out of space, so we are definitely going to have to switch to the other side of my arm at some point, because Mother has made a lot of purples. Moving into the Mothership 6 Midnight Sun, we have one of the few more cool toned purples in Pat McGrath's collection, and that is this shade over here. That is the shade Blitz Violet Orchid. It's one of her special shades, and it is one of my favorites because I really love these like more cool toned, blue toned, periwinkle type of blues, and like you can tell that she has definitely a preference for warmer purples when it comes to the color purple, and I love this shade because it's one of the few which leans a little bit cooler, and it has just such a beautiful texture to it. Next, as I mentioned, we have a shade which is featured in both the Divine Rose 1 palette as well as the Sublime palette, and that is this shade over here. That is the shade Rose Dusk. Again, one could argue that this isn't really a purple shade, but it's more of like a mauvey pink shade. But let's swatch it for good measure. Yeah, this is not really a purple. Yeah, I was right in the first place to not really include it. You can see how much more of a different tone this has compared to the other shades, but I just wanted to swatch it just in case. Move to Divine Rose 2, where we actually have two purples. We have this shade, the shade Extravaganza. No, Eleganza. I always want to call this shade Extravaganza, and it's actually called Eleganza. Anyway, and this shade over here, which is again one of those more plummy toned purples. So let's watch Eleganza. Eleganza is absolutely stunning, by the way. And this shade is also a very nice shade. It has a beautiful texture to it, and it actually works really well. I'm actually now going to start swatching them on the other side of my hand because I ran out of space here. But here we have Eleganza, and here we have Extreme Burgundy. Again, are they really purples? I don't know. I would consider them in the family of like light plummy purples, but you could also call them mauvey pinks. So I don't know, you can tell me whether you consider these two shades to be purples. I would consider them somewhere on the spectrum of purples, but certainly not... Hey Kitty, you have an opinion on this as well? Certainly not a true purple like, say, Purple Rain, for instance. But like I said, for the sake of the video, I really wanted to include everything that would even be in the vicinity of a color purple. Now let's move on into her quads, where I feel like pretty much most of them contain some sort of a purple. The first one I want to swatch for you is Nocturnal Nirvana, where without a doubt we have this beautiful purple over here, which I don't know the name of as usual. This is the shade Blitz Purple. Blitz Purple is a very, very deep purple, but it's not a blackened purple. Like, it has a black base, but when you swatch it, you can definitely tell that there is also quite a lot of purple. It's not as smoky as, say, something like Smoked Amethyst, where you can definitely tell that there is a base and a lot of sparkle. Here there is a very dark base, but you can also clearly tell that there's a lot of like that pink overlay, and when we shine the artificial light on it in a bit, you're going to see that it's also loaded with pink sparkle. It's actually a really, really beautiful shade. And what I like to do with this shade is I like to smoke it out all over my lid and put Synthetica over top of that, because the two look absolutely stunning together. Next, from her Ritualistic Rose Quad, again, we might argue whether it's really a purple, but I would consider it on like the warmer side of the purples, and that is the shade over here. I'm so sorry, I don't know the name and I'm too lazy to look it up, but let's watch it for good measure, just because it has some purple sparkle to it. It's one of her special shades, so of course it's loaded with a beautiful sheen and sparkle, and it's one of the most complex shades in this quad, and I absolutely love it. And now let's move on into the look squads. I don't really know in what order these are, so we're just going to open them and find out. Okay, first one, we have Interstellar Icon. This shade over here, the shade Blue Blood, also featured in the Decadence palette. As I mentioned, I was going to show you the purple from the Decadence through the Interstellar Icon quad. Again, it is a very deep plummy purple. And when you compare this purple to the one in the Dark Star 6 pan, which is, I think this one, you can definitely tell this one is in the same veins, but it's just so much deeper compared to the Blue Blood shade. I actually prefer Blue Blood because I'm not a huge fan of these like really like blackened sort of purples. I find something like this much easier to work with. This also has like this beautiful texture to it. It's not a true metallic, but it's more of like that satin finish, so it is just such an easy eyeshadow to work with. Next we have Risque Rose, and I would argue that the absolutely glorious, famous Lavendaring is a purple, because it has a ton of things going on to it. Of course, it has like this almost like green silver base, and then it has those purple sparkles, so it's a very complex shade which I find very difficult to describe, but I am going to put it in the category purple because it has a very strong purple reflect to it. I don't know whether it's coming across on camera, I hope it is. It is such an incredibly complex and beautiful shade. You can literally layer Lavendaring over top of everything and it will look magnificent every single fucking time. I don't know how, but it does. Next we have the latest release in her eyeshadow palette collection. This is the Eternal Eden Quad, where I would say that this shade over here is more, it does belong a little bit to the purple color family, maybe more towards the mauve side, but let's swatch it as a warm purple. It is such a glorious metallic shade. I absolutely love it. It reminds me a lot of the shade from the Ritualistic Rose Quad, but the Ritualistic Rose Quad has much more sparkle, whereas this is just so much more like punchy. And you guys, I can't believe we've reached this point, but we are actually about to swatch the last purple that I personally am aware of in Pat McGrath's eyeshadow palette collection. This is the shade, what's this called again? Lavender Blue from her Fleur Fantasia Quad. This is a very like lavender purple shade with a blue duochrome to it. It's not one of her metallic shades, it's definitely one of those shades that has a very like satin finish to it, but you can make it more metallic if you wet it or you put it over top of glitter glue. It's a very like pastel leaning, very soft, very gentle shade, which you can build up to have a little bit more intensity, but I think it's just meant to be more of a pastel shade and it works beautifully for that. So guys, here you have the purple eyeshadow extravaganza that are Pat McGrath purple eyeshadows. And in case that wasn't enough, here is a little bit more. And I want to try to shine the artificial lighting from my phone on this so that you can see how they look like when you shine an artificial source of light, that you can see all the beautiful sparklies, in the ones that have sparklies anyway. Look how gorgeous these are, oh my goodness. Alright you guys, I think I'm just going to include the pinks in this video because I have the palettes out anyway, so let's just do it while I'm at it. Let's move into the pinks, where I'm going to try to again be as broad as possible and include everything that I think has some sort of a pink hue to it. So let's start with Mothership 3 Subversive, where I want to swatch two shades for you. These are the VR Pink shade and the Astral Ghost Orchid shade. The Astral shade is also featured in her Mothership 2 Sublime. So let's start with this one. This is an absolutely terrible shade, I'm sorry to say that, but the texture of this shade just does not at all compare to the rest of the special shades that she has in her palettes, and it's probably like one of the worst textures that she has ever created. It's just incredibly dry and it doesn't really ever do much for me. I always have to like really struggle to make it look half decent. I don't know what's up with this shade. If it had the texture that the VR Pink shade has, it would have been absolutely beautiful, but for whatever reason it doesn't, and I just don't like this shade. It has a white base with these gorgeous light pink sparkles on it, and there is a similar shade in the Subliminal palette, also an Astral shade, which has a much better texture and a much better duochrome. On the other hand, the shade VR Pink has an absolutely stunning texture to it. It's just such a gorgeous shade. It is a gold duochrome with a sort of like peachy pink sparkle to it. It is just such a stunning shade, such a beautiful duochrome. I love this shade. Next we have the Mothership 5 Bronze Seduction palette. I'm not really sure, I think she qualifies this as a bronze shade, but I consider it to be like a bronzy pink shade. So I'm going to swatch it for you because I do think it belongs a little bit in like the pinkish sort of family. Actually, she does call this shade Rose Gold 005, so she herself thinks that this is a like rose based shade, which is why I am going to include this in this video. It's not a straight up pink, but it does belong in like the rose colored family. Next up, I want to swatch for you two shades from the Divine Rose 2 palette. These are these two over here. This is the shade VR Rose Venus, and this is Iridescent Pink 003. By the way, this shade comes also in her highlighter trio, just in case you don't have this eyeshadow palette, but you do have the highlighter trio, you do own this shade. VR Rose Venus is one of the most beautiful duochromes that Pat has ever made. It has this beautiful texture to it, and Iridescent Pink is just such a cool shade. So here you have VR Rose Venus, and here you have Iridescent Pink. VR Rose Venus is my absolute favorite, like summer one and done eyeshadow, because it's so beautiful, it's so complex, it has this gorgeous like cool toned hot pink base to it, and then this like sort of lime green golden duochrome, super stunning. And the Iridescent 003 pink shade is such a cool shade. You can use this as a topper, you can use it underneath eyeshadows to change their hue a little bit, you can use it as a face highlighter, you can use it on your brow bone. It's just one of those really versatile shades. It has a very beautiful and soft texture to it, and the duochrome on it is just super stunning. Let's move into what would be considered the more like straight up true pinks, where the first one is this shade from the Divine Rose 2 palette. I can't remember the name of it, but as you can tell, it's a hot pink, and it's one of my favorite hot pinks from Pat because it has a bit more of like a warmer hue to it and a bit of like a golden sheen, which makes it, in my opinion, a little bit more, I don't know, flattering. I find hot pinks to be so incredibly stark against my skin tone that most of them just look too stark and I don't like them. But this one has a little bit of like softness to it and a little bit of that sheen, which I don't know, I really like this shade. Let's move on to the 6 pans, where I think the only one I can think of that has a true pink is again the Lavender Rose, which is the shade Rose Risque. And I actually am not a huge fan of Rose Risque. I don't like the texture of this shade. I think it's too blue toned for my taste, and it just does not flatter me one bit. You can clearly tell that this is more cool toned compared to the shade from the Divine Rose 2 palette. Now, since we have started on the hot pinks, let's just continue swatching hot pinks, and the next one I want to swatch for you is this one here, that is the shade Rose Rebellion from the Risque Rose quad. I've actually swatched all of these side by side also in the video that I made for this eyeshadow quad, but I want to do it here as well. So what's special about this shade is that it's in her cream to powder formula. It's actually a new formula for her. It has never been featured before in any of her eyeshadows and eyeshadow palettes, and that was one of the reasons I really wanted to have this quad for. But I ended up falling in love with it because of the quad as a whole. Now, this shade, again, in terms of its undertones, it's not my favorite because it leans again a little bit more on the cooler side, but I love the texture of it. You can clearly feel that creaminess to it when you swatch it, and it's just such a pleasant texture to work with. So while I don't really like the tones of this, I do like using it because it's such an interesting because it's such an interesting texture to work with. So when you put these three next to each other, you can tell this one has the most pleasant, I think, and most flattering undertone. This one has a relatively, you know, flattering undertone for those who can pull it off, and a very pleasant texture. And this one in the middle is just the worst of both worlds. It doesn't have a good texture, it doesn't have a good formula, and it's also a very unflattering shade. Sorry, Pat, that's just my honest opinion. Now, I want to actually swatch the shade from the Eternal Eden quad next for you, because I feel like of all the like hot pinks that she has done, The one in the Eternal Quad, so this shade over here, that is the shade Pink Mystique, is my absolute favorite from her. So we're going to swatch both of these shades because they're both pinks, but I wanted to start with this one because it's a softer, more mid-tone pink, and in my opinion just looks so much more flattering on me because it's less stark of an undertone. And the other shade in this palette I wanted to swatch for you, and this is the shade Temptation, this is the shade Pink Mystique. Pink Mystique is one of my newest favorites one and done eyeshadows because it has this beautiful warm pink undertone and a golden sheen to it, and it just looks so flattering on me for some reason. I never thought that a pink eyeshadow can look flattering on me, but this one really does. I love this shade. Now let's watch a very similar eyeshadow that comes in one of her Opulence 2019 collection quads, and that is from the Ritualistic Rose. I want to swatch this shade for you because to me that is essentially the same shade that we just swatched now from the Eternal Eden quad, but in her special formula, so it's loaded with much more sparkle. Look how incredibly gorgeous that is. So that is again a light pink base, but this time loaded with very intense golden sparkle. So these two shades also work really beautifully together because you can layer this over this to get more sparkle, because this has like more satin shimmer formula to it. It's not a straight up metallic, so if you want to get that sparkle, you can layer this shade over top and you get basically the best of both worlds. And last but not least, you could argue whether that is really a pink shade, but to me it has like a very like hot pink duochrome to it, so I will include it here. It is from the Fleur Fantasia quad, and it is this shade over here, the shade Iridescent Orchid, correct? It is just such a beautiful shade. It reminds me a little bit of VR Pink, but in a metallic formula. Let's watch that right here, shall we? This is just such a stunning shade because it is technically not one of her special shades, but you can absolutely layer it over top of other shades to get that like hot pink sparkle. I really love to layer this shade over top of the one from the Eternal Eden quad, and I just think it's such a beautiful and versatile shade. I really like this shade as well. So there you have all of Pat's pinks next to each other. So many pinks. She likes her pinks. And of course this video wouldn't be complete if we didn't shine an artificial light on them. So let's just do that as well and admire at the sparkle. And so you guys, that will be all from me today. I really hope that you enjoyed this swatching of purple and pink eyeshadows from Pat McGrath. It's probably going to be a long video, but I hope that you enjoyed it. Personally, I really enjoyed it. I especially liked seeing all of these like pink hues because now I'm full of ideas of how to like layer them together and how to combine them together, which is not something I ever thought of before. If you have any ideas about something else we can swatch from Pat McGrath, let me know. I will be more than happy to oblige. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!